All right, so now we got the right image. So today's topic, teaching or manipulating, the challenge of spiritual knowledge. And this entire month, those 3 sessions Mary Rose just mentioned, they focus on these 3 human abilities or expressions: speaking, or the power of the word. This is also what we kind of deepened last week: teaching, and doing or action. So last week we talked about the power of the words, the speaking. And with words or speaking, what we were referring to is more this creative power, the manifestation of the idea that is coming, and which is an expression of what is within us, of our state of being. So when we are speaking, we are conveying this inner essence to others around us, which in a way is teaching. And following teaching then is action. It's just turning it into the reality of life here. So here you can see an overview, and in the left window there it says, like on top, spirit as spaces. And what we talked about or explained last week, and we want to continue on with today, it's if our inner essence is based on the spirit, this spark of the divine spirit everyone carries in their heart, then the words, the ideas that are spoken will be truth. And not in the personal sense of truth, but think more about the absolute truth. And absolute truth brings goodness. And again, think in a sense of the absolute goodness, as it's also mentioned in the scriptures. And subsequently, what is following then is the action or the doing based on the spirit will also show the corresponding results. So everything based on the spirit within, and therefore an expression and the manifestation of the spirit. If you look on the right side little window where it says ego as basis, this is if our inner essence or our state of being, of consciousness, is not based on the spirit spark in our heart, but it's based on an I-centered state of being or consciousness. And don't think about it in a negative way of egoism and not so. More think of seeing the world with the I at the center. This is what we mean here with ego. And so if it's based on that, then what is spoken, the words, is a lie. Again, not on the personal level, but lie as in being ignorant of the absolute truth, being separated from the divine spirit, because the I, the ego, can only define itself by separating me and the outside or the others. So, but this is not in accordance with what the divine spirit is. So it is separated from the absolute truth. And consequently, what is conveyed as the inner essence in words, in speaking, so what teaching would be, is also separated from the absolute goodness and results in evil. And evil it means here in not being an instrument of the spirit, not fulfilling what the divine, the spirit, the way it would unfold. So in a way of evil in the sense of not being in harmony with the divine spirit. So think of the separation of the ego, because the ego exists only by separation. Think of that. And what is then manifested also in action, in reality, can only increase the separation and the opposites and so on. Nothing else can develop from that. So those are the two major differences. So when words and teachings originate from a state of ego consciousness, they can only create and manifest in accordance with this state of separation. Because if you think of ego, you could describe it as a state of fundamental separation and also like a total emptiness or lack. There's always something lacking, missing, because we are separated from the one, from the whole. And consequently, also the ego, it's always a state of fear. It doesn't matter on which level, but ego can be defined by fear. This is what kind of propels us. Therefore, we need to exert control or try to dominate in whichever way, or just for self-maintenance. So therefore, the action of the ego, so the teachings and the actions, they can bring only, in a way, coercion, manipulation, injustice. So the decisive question is, what is the basis for our words, our speaking, our teaching, and our acting, our doing? Is our consciousness centered on the spirit or the ego? So today we will focus mostly, or will kind of deepen our understanding about the middle level here, about the teaching. But all of this with regard to spiritual development. So in this way, teaching can be understood as conveying spiritual knowledge, conveying what is perceived as inner truth. And it can go in two ways. Teaching can be a bridge to a true awakening to life, life in capital letters, in itself. But it can also, this teaching can also create a dependence on belief systems and even turn out or end up in a kind of manipulation. It depends on both, because it is an interaction between the speaker and the listener, or the teacher and the student. So let's take a closer look. How does kind of dependence that can happen in many ways? And you will probably recognize aspects of it that you have experienced them, or there's something, it sounds familiar. So there is first the dependence of the student on teachings. And this is almost like becoming trapped in what is said in the teachings. And it's more like a dogmatic or blind belief, firmly holding on to the teachings for an inner stability, for an inner identification with the teachings. So then it's not freeing. Next would be then dependence of the student on the institution or the school itself. And very similar, this dependence is an identification through the institution that I am what the institution is, but I cannot see it in self-authority. And then there's also dependence on a personal level, student to teacher, or the master or the guru, whatever it may be. It's this dependence on what the teacher says. And then the seeker needs the teacher to tell him what to do, what to believe, what is true, what is not true. And it's kind of he or she follows the seeker or the master blindly or dogmatically. So the teacher becomes like the compass of the life of the seeker. But our compass in life that really gives us direction should be the spirit spark in our heart, not an external authority or school or anything. And then there's also the dependence of the teacher on the student. And you'll understand in a sec what we mean with this. Teaching, as I said earlier, it's the words, the speaking convey the state of consciousness of the teacher or the speaker. So if the state of consciousness of being of the teacher is based on the I, then the listeners or the followers, by following the teacher, by paying attention or being focused on what the teacher said, they strengthen the prison of the I consciousness of the teacher. And to understand this, just think of social media with all its followers and the importance of getting likes and whatever. And kind of let it resonate with you what it does, how it feels, how it kind of strengthens our identification as I being. And because because whatever, oh, sorry, hang on, I lost track with my notes. So all of this, what I try to explain here, it's not to point fingers or to judge or to criticize or to jump to conclusions about an institution or a person, but it's to make you aware of all these different dynamics that play out within us. Because in life, we are all learners or students, but at the same time, we are also all teachers, because the words, the ideas that rise up from within us that we convey to others, this is how we manifest, how we teach or convey the essence of our state of being. So we have an effect on our surroundings and also the other way around. So the key to all of this is honest self-observation, self-awareness, in short, self-knowledge. And we could ask if whatever we say we do, is it based on a state of consciousness based on the I? Or is there something that is based on this different aspect in our heart, the spark of the spirit within us? With my words, what do I convey? What do I teach? And then we can ask us this question: do I want to be an instrument, a servant of the spirit within me? Or is my state of being focused solely on my I? Teaching is about conveying knowledge, but there is the risk that knowledge can become a golden cage or a golden prison if it remains just beautiful theory. And if it does not become a lived reality, if it only remains a mental concept, then it's the danger or the risk of becoming a new prison of our I consciousness. This can happen on a larger scale, like for institutions or schools, and on a smaller scale on an individual level. For institutions, the risk is that it would exist only for themselves and not to serve their actual purpose. Because the purpose is to teach the seeker about the origin and purpose of their existence and show the seeker the path to liberation, to tear down these walls. But then it might happen that institutions would only apply a different spiritual color to the same prison walls of the I consciousness. And on the individual level, it's this that we kind of pile up all this knowledge, all the ready-made answers, memorize them like vocabulary, but this kind of knowledge never is turned into reality. We does not let our life be changed by that. It's not about becoming a specialist with a lot of piled up knowledge, but the aim of the teachings is, of the knowledge, to liberate us, to liberate the seeker. And with this now, over to you, Wuji.
So, friends, we may ask ourselves the question, what is the most important thing for a seeker of truth? Self-knowledge. That is the knowledge that comes from being in the spirit in us, the little living out of the spirit in us, and allowing that light from that divine spark in us shine in our consciousness and show us who we truly are. And not only show us the way, but also strengthen in us our resolve to walk that path. And so, once we have some amount of self-knowledge, what is also important is that we have a critical mind, a mind that can be able to give us abstract thoughts, critical thinking, and that we would be able to bear responsibility after we have been illuminated in us the path that we need to return to the true nature of our being. And how we take that responsibility daily in our daily choices, and also how we choose to make it active in our lives. So we turn theory into practice, because that is in reality how it would manifest in daily life. Therefore, it is important that we ask ourselves, does a teaching serve freedom, or is it serving our ego? Because if it serves freedom, then it leads us to a certain inner autonomy. We have to take actions. We have to be able to discern with a certain critical thinking mind. But if it is serving our ego, then it binds us to those identities, to those measured truths, and we become reliant on that, and it dominates us. Therefore, as we learn from the universal teachings, we learn in our daily lives of practice and the lessons from that. All of these teachings are meant to lead us to have a certain inner autonomy of the consciousness. Because a consciousness that has autonomy would guide us towards greater understanding and integration with the original plan for humanity. And so we got to ask ourselves the question, do we want autonomy or do we want the various levels of dependence that Regina talked about already? And to understand the various structures of dependency. Are you the type who is always looking for the latest information? Are you the type who always wants to have a very clear idea of things before you can take the next step? Are you the type who always wants the next insight, which means you are always looking for something external to you that gives you reassurances, and therefore you become dependent on that? And to be able to understand who we are in self-knowledge, it's important to understand our dependencies. It's important to understand our structure as an ego personality, because the ego's structure depends on repetition, on accumulation of knowledge, and through those of self-confirmation that accumulation of knowledge was a good thing. And so we find ways to justify it. And so if we understand that that's the basis of the ego, if that's how the ego structure is, then what we would then do is understand that we have the opportunity to have a different life that comes from that divine spirit we've been talking about. And as we have been talking about teaching, whether as a student teacher or as an institution, it's important to understand the various roles. Since we are trying to move away from dependency, we're trying to move away from the attachments that come about as a result of our dependencies. A teacher's role is to guard the inner space in our lives, is to guard the inner space of the student, the pupil, the curious one, the seeker of truth, not to intervene in their development by pointing out specific things for them to do, but to be able to guarantee that they have an environment and a space where they would be able to understand from within who they truly are, and to protect that space, to protect the conditions that guarantee that space. And as an institution, to assist that seeker of truth in that inner path that they are walking. And for example, imagine a midwife assisting the birth of a child. And that midwife or that doula is there to facilitate the birthing process. They do not own the child is not theirs, but they are facilitating the birthing process or the bringer to life of a new being by providing tools, by providing an environment, by providing the conditions that help in the birth of a new spiritual life in us. Therefore, when we look at life, as Regina has spoken about in the beginning, teaching should lead us to autonomy. Teaching should lead us to liberation. Teaching should not lead us to a manipulation of information whereby we are kept a prisoner or dependent on the teacher, a fellow student, or an institution. And therefore, we need to be able to understand clearly that if teaching is to lead us to liberation, we should not confuse the map and the journey that each of us have to take. And that journey is where in our school, and looking at the symbols of our school, we start off with the point in the center, the spirit, the divine spark, because from there, everything is possible.